Well, why don't we get started? Good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Tim Runge, and I am a patent educational consultant out of the central office. And I appreciate the fact that you all have elected to take time out of your busy schedule and among a variety of wonderful sessions at the same time to join me for a workshop on classroom management strategies applicable for any school age setting, so kindergarten through 12th grade, although I would submit that many of these strategies could also extend downward into preschool early intervention, as well as extend into post-secondary settings. So just a few housekeeping matters before we begin. Due to the size of the number of individuals who have joined this session today, we have muted everyone, with the exception of those of us who are facilitating or working behind the scenes. And so, unfortunately, we won't be able to take any questions from you by having you simply unmute and then ask your question. However, there is a solution to this conundrum, and that is the chat feature is still available. And so if you have a question because I didn't teach something well enough, or you want to understand how you can apply that particular concept to your own setting, please, we encourage you to use the chat feature. And so while you are unable to unmute yourself, you are able, however, to use the chat feature to ask questions. And in fact, as we will see a little bit later on, I'm going to be inviting all of you to use the chat feature so that we can do some formative assessment throughout our session. I am joined today by one of our school psych apprentices, Caroline Say, who is going to be facilitating as well with me, and she's going to be making sure that I am monitoring that chat. And if I don't see a chat, she has the power to interrupt me. She can actually speak and unmute, so she will interrupt me with questions. So don't worry if you put a question in and I don't see it. Caroline is going to see it, and she will subsequently unmute and then ask the question on your behalf. And then also we are supported by Mark Edom, who is our tech support, one of our tech supports at the Patent Central office. And so if you have any tech-related questions or concerns, Mark would be the person that you could submit a comment or a question in the chat, and he can help address as well. So those are the two individuals who are, again, integral to today's session, and I wanted to publicly thank them and acknowledge their support in this work. So again, any questions related to tech, Mark Edom is going to be your point person, and any questions of me, please put those in the chat, and either I will see it, or if I happen to miss it, then Caroline will read that question, or at least interrupt me and tell me to go read that question on your behalf. Okay, so that said, our housekeeping, one other final housekeeping matter, and that is if you require closed captioning and you are unsure of how to access the closed captioning, then simply move your cursor along the bottom of the screen of your screen, and you should see, in my vantage point, it's three little dots, and then you click on that and you go to settings, and you can then access the closed captioning feature. And that's the closed captioning that's occurring through Zoom, not through PowerPoint. So that, again, is the closed captioning feature within Zoom. Okay, therefore, for the next 71 minutes or 70 minutes, we are going to go on a journey and review various, hopefully meaningful and practical strategies one can use with regard to supporting the behavior of students in classroom settings. Now, I appreciate that this is a math conference, and so just a little bit of a background on me so that you understand who I am and from where I came. I am not a mathematics teacher. In fact, I am not a certified teacher at all. I am a certified school psychologist and was a practitioner in South Central Pennsylvania for about a decade. Also was briefly a special education administrator. After which, excuse me, I then was a trainer of school psychologists for a period of time, and now I am at Patent Central as one of our educational consultants, and I work on a number of initiatives, including the MTSS initiative, or Multi-Tiered Systems of Support initiative, as well as our behavior initiative, otherwise known as Learning Environment and Engagement, LEEI initiative. And then, given my professional credentials, I am also on the school psychology initiative. So there are a number of initiatives that are related to today's topic, and that is both MTSS as well as behavior, otherwise known as learning, environment, and engagement. And that those two kind of bring together or integrate very nicely into an approach that we view, and the research would strongly suggest, is an evidence-based set of practices that can be applied in virtually any classroom setting to support the behavioral needs of students, so that you as instructors or as administrators can maximize the amount of allocated time you have with your learners and thus increase academic learning. And so we appreciate you joining us today. Again, I recognize that there are many really, really good sessions right at the same time, but across today and yesterday. And so the fact that you have selected to join us here today gives me, great optimism that you're going to want to learn something and hopefully take away a few things from today's session. All right. I think those are the housekeeping matters. As it relates to specific content for today's session, you can access all of the materials, including the slide deck, as well as a few resources and some documents related to some activities that I have built into today's session via a Padlet. If you would like, take your mobile device and scan in the QR code, and that takes you directly to the Padlet. Or if you want, you can, and thank you, Caroline. Caroline's doing it, and I'm going to do it again as well. Or if you don't want to use the QR code, there's the link in the chat. This Padlet will remain available as long as I'm affiliated with Patton. We don't take them down because we feel as though these are resources that you would hopefully use right now, but likely would want to revisit later on, especially as you move into the next academic year. And I'm just going to pop out of the PowerPoint for a brief moment and just show you very quickly an overview of the Padlet, just so you get an understanding of what all is available. So if you've done the QR code or you have clicked on the hyperlink that Caroline has posted in the chat, then you should see something like this. Please note, I've asked Caroline to put that same link in the chat a handful of times here early on in our session in case anybody joins a little bit late. They don't have the luxury of seeing the chat history prior to their entrance into Zoom. So if you see that link being populated in the chat multiple times, don't worry, it's the same link. It all goes to this. So there's not a ton of information in here because, in fact, I don't want to overwhelm you. Although I guess if I wanted to, I could, because I have a lot of rich set of materials related to classroom management. But on the left-hand side, you see the slide deck for today's presentation. Then we have a few resources, a limited number of resources, some Patton resources that are there, as well as a research article that basically backs up everything I'm going to share with you today. And then an oldie but a goodie in my experience, this is a protocol for setting up a group contingency. And we'll talk about group contingencies at the very end. It's something that I created, I can't believe that I'm saying this, 16 years ago. And I think it's still relevant today. Then as well, on the right-hand side, you see a couple of activities and documents for activities. It is my aspiration that we get to all of these activities, but I also probably over-prepared, and so there might be one activity that we don't get to, but it is noted in the slide deck, and then the resources are there for your benefit. Okay, this is the last time I'm going to go into the Padlet, but I just did want to share that with you in case you are less familiar with Padlet than maybe those of us who have used Padlet many times in the past. Okay, if you've ever been in a session with me and you know a thing or two about, or you know a thing or two about classroom management, and we are in fact a classroom here in a virtual platform, but we are nonetheless in a classroom. One of the surest ways of making sure that you have a well-maintained set of students to teach is to figure out multiple ways in which you can actively engage your learners. Again, if students are engaged, meaningfully engaged in their learning, they are less prone to misbehavior. So one of the surest ways of ensuring that we have a well-managed classroom is building lots of active engagement activities in our lesson. I talk about that in my workshops, but I also want to make sure that I'm actually doing that in the workshops themselves. So bear with me here. I have a couple of active engagement activities. You don't have to know any content in order to engage in these opening activities. This is just a way to get you involved, especially after lunch and perhaps maybe sitting most of yesterday and today during this conference. So what I'd like you to do right now is to go into the chat. And by now, I imagine virtually everybody is familiar with Zoom, but if you're not, it's okay. You just put your cursor around the fringes of your screen and up will appear the toolbar, and just click on the chat icon that I have highlighted here. And what I'm asking you to do real quick, if you don't mind, is just please provide your title and your school district. We already know your name, or at least your Zoom ID, so you don't have to necessarily put that in there. I like to do this just to kind of get a sense of who I have in the audience, and both in terms of professional role, but also your location. And I've been in education in Pennsylvania for 26 years, so I've been to almost every intermediate unit across my professional career. And while I have not been to every district, of course, I know where most districts are, so it does help me. This is great. Wonderful to see a lot of new names, or names with which I am less familiar. And admittedly, it warms my heart to see some names of people that I have had some longstanding experiences with, either professionally within schools, or I think there's even a few of my former students who are now school psychologists in the audience. That is wonderful to see. Okay, thank you very much for engaging in that brief opportunity to get you involved. I have a few more, so you can't go to rest just yet. Another feature that I like to use within the Zoom environment is stamping. And for the benefit of those who have never done this before, or maybe haven't reached a fluency stage of using the stamping feature within Zoom, I have hopefully what are accurate, clear, explicit instructions on how to access the stamping feature. So the images that I have in front of you are images generated from a PC Zoom platform. My understanding is that a Mac version of Zoom is similar, but may not look exactly the same as what you see before you. My apologies that I don't have that set of screenshots available. But the first thing you want to do is find your toolbar in Zoom. Once again, you want to hover your cursor around the fringes or the margins of the screen to access the toolbar. For me, it happens to be at the top. For some of you, maybe on the side. And then you want to click this icon that looks like a pencil that says annotate. Or a shortcut is, most of us now in the bottom left or right corner, that same annotate image appears in kind of a grayed out circle with green highlights. But the surefire way is just to follow this first step. So once you click on that annotate icon, then you will get a separate annotation bar that has a whole host of options. And the one that I need you to select then is the icon that has a blue square with a white check mark. So click that one. That's the the stamping feature. Once you do that, you get another set of options. And here is where you select the icon that you want to stamp with. So in essence, what's going to happen is once you select your icon, every time you click your mouse or click your touchpad, you're going to leave a stamp on the screen that everybody can see. And so what we're going to do here is in a moment, give you an opportunity to start. And folks have already started doing that. Great. So go ahead and stamp on this screen. Fantastic. And you will also notice that as you stamp, your Zoom ID appears for a brief moment. This is wonderful. It's like a Jackson Pollock work of art. You know, everybody's just like splattering stamps all over the place. Beautiful. Okay. So now here's the key, the next step. This is hugely important. That's why I put it in red. You will continue stamping every time you click your touchpad or your mouse, unless or until you subsequently select the red X, the red square with a white X. So I encourage you to practice that skill right now. Click the red square with a white X, and the moment you do that, then also start clicking on the screen, and you should no longer be stamping. If you're still stamping, then you didn't stop Zoom from stamping. So you want to make sure you're doing that step 4 very, very carefully. The reason being is that in a moment, I'm going to have you start stamping again. And if you forget to stop stamping 5-10 minutes from now, when you have an urgent email that you think you need to attend to, you're going to click on your screen to go to your email, and you're going to accidentally stamp. And then everybody's going to know that, uh-oh, you were doing something else. So please, please, please make sure you not only gain acquisition of and fluency of stamping, but then subsequently gain acquisition of and fluency of stopping the stamping feature. All right, so at this point in time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of everyone's drawings. So we've cleared the screen. Now we're going to do, we already did that. I want to find out where you are in terms of your location. So go ahead and start stamping. And you probably only need to stamp once here. So you can elect to then stop your stamping, or you can keep the stamping feature on because the next slide has an additional stamping question. But I like to get a lay of the land as to where people are within Pennsylvania, recognizing that some of you may be outside of Pennsylvania. So I have a playground for you to all hang out with in the upper right quadrant. If you happen to be in another state, or if you are truly dedicated and you're on vacation and you're still attending this conference, then like super kudos to you. All right, I'll probably just give you another 10 seconds or so to stamp. And again, if you want to stop stamping, that's fine, but I'm going to have you stamp on the next slide anyway, so you could conceivably keep your stamping activities active. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, oops, where did I'm going to get rid of everyone's drawings. We have one more stamping feature, and that is, hey, it's summer. For some of you, I believe you just finished up your school year, maybe the last couple of days. I am aware of at least a handful of school districts in which today is their last day, or where I am in the western side of Pennsylvania, schools ended at the end of May, so we are already in our second or third week of summer. So please stamp, what is your dream vacation location? Not like, I mean, you could put where you're going if this year happens to be your dream vacation. But if you had unlimited resources, both financial and time, where would you go? Got some folks that want to go to Hawaii. Hawaii is going to be overwhelmed with Pennsylvanians. That's good. We got a lot of folks interested in going to Europe, Australia, down under. We've got, looks like Japan. This is testing my knowledge of geography. We got the Caribbean, a fair number. Wow, we have someone who wants to go way to the southern tip of South America. That is fantastic. And I believe that's Chile. But if I'm wrong, I apologize in that error. Okay, I'll give you maybe just another 10 seconds. This is the last time I'm going to ask you to stamp. So please make sure that you turn off your stamping feature, lest you accidentally stamp 5 minutes from now when you think you're closing out your Zoom window to go into a different window. All right. Well, thank you for engaging in that annotated feature of my warm-up. Again, it's not specific to content clearly in today's session, but it is an attempt to get you engaged at the beginning of our session before we now start diving into content. And that frankly is yet another classroom management strategy that we know works well, is to get folks engaged, get your learners engaged early on, and maybe even hopefully excited about the content. Now, I know my content is not about dream vacations, but if we can get our learners excited about content at the very beginning, then that is going to improve the quality of our classroom management. Okay, make sure, please, everybody, you've turned off your stamping by going to annotation, look for the red square with the white X, click on that, and then you should be good to go in terms of using your mouse or your touchpad without accidentally continuing to stamp. All right. So before we even begin with content, I want to talk about, let's set some norms or expectations that we have of each other with regard to how we're going to run our session for the remaining 55 minutes. And this is actually going to relate to a practice that I'm going to review content-wise a little bit later on. But for now, again, I want to try to model the things that I hope we all would do in whatever our classroom environment might be. So if we say on the left-hand side that in order for us to be meaningfully engaged and participatory in today's session, I would like for not only me, but all of you to be ready, be responsible, and be respectful. So I would hope that all of us are ready to learn, that we are responsible while we are engaged with and attending this session, and that we are respectful of each other. Now, those three norms or expectations sound really good, but in terms of operationalizing them, there may be slightly difference of opinions. Like, what does it mean to be ready? What does it mean to be responsible or respectful? Because each one of us has maybe a slightly different interpretation of what it means to be ready, responsible, or respectful in a virtual learning environment like we are today. So what I'd like to do is, and this is where I'm going to solicit any of you to put in the chat, and Caroline, please help me. What does it mean to be ready, responsible, or respectful? So first, so what does it mean to be ready? Well, I think it means to be at your computer watching and listening. But what are some other things that might be illustrative or demonstrative of us being ready to engage in today's session? So please put in the chat, and I apologize, I won't be able to get all of them, but I'll at least grab one or two and put it in this matrix. Okay, so thank you, Brooklyn. Thank you, Missy. Ooh, there was one. All materials, if needed, are out and prepared. Thank you, Michaela. And again, I'm not suggesting the other comments are less important. I'm just randomly picking out a couple. So you have a mindset for learning. Thank you, Missy. All right, so that is, here are, and forgive me for not having the same font size or style, all of this, but I'm just copying and pasting. So here is a set of examples of what it looks like for us to be ready, acknowledging that there were more that were put in the chat. So thank you to everyone who did put in the chat. So thank you, Christy and Brooklyn and Missy, Michaela, Kim, Elizabeth, Michelle, Patrick, et al. Thank you all for putting comments. I'm sorry that I couldn't fit all of them in there. Let's move on to the next one. What does it mean to be responsible? Well, I initially thought being responsible means that you're focused on this session, you're ignoring as best you can distractions, like if you're at home, the dog barking or the kids saying, I need your help, or if there is a legitimate distraction, like, your fire alarm goes off, then please exit. So what else does it mean to be responsible? Thank you, Patrick and Georgianne. Willing to grow your craft. I like that, Patrick. I'm gonna put that here. Again, I'm only going to take a smattering of examples, recognizing that there are lots of other really, really good ideas that are being posted. Okay. Thank you, Missy, Diane, Angie, and others for posting in the chat. Wonderful. Now that last thing, oops, sorry, scrolled ahead too early. The last one, what does it mean to be respectful? Well, my initial thought was you invite perspectives, or I'd like to invite perspectives or comments or questions from others, particularly all of you. What are some other illustrations of what it might be to be respectful in our learning environment right now? Please go ahead and put those in the chat, and I will grab a few and put them in. Thank you, Christy. Using annotated tools correctly and when prompted. Yes. All right. And as I said, with the previous ones, I am unfortunately not going to be able to publicly acknowledge every single one of you who have offered up something in the chat, but I do appreciate the fact that all of you, or many of you, are very much actively engaged. So there we go. I just grabbed a few in there. So thank you, Cassie and Mandy, and I'm intermittently reinforcing, not everyone, but some of you, of course. Elizabeth, thank you. So we've got at least the start of some operationally defined behaviors that are demonstrative of what I would hope would be all of us being ready, responsible, and respectful. What I've just walked us through is actually a set of content that I'm going to revisit later on in our session with regard to what's an evidence-based practice to get not only engagement from your own learners and a sense of ownership from our learners about their own behavior, is using what we refer to as a behavior matrix, where we have conversations with, now depending upon your learners, the age of your learners or the developmental status of your learners. Older learners, you could engage with them and they could participate in this process. Younger learners, like 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, I don't know that you want to ask them what they think it means to be ready, responsible, and respectful. So in those contexts, the instructor probably wants to provide the examples of what does this look like or sound like, instead of opening up to a bunch of 3-year-olds who are going to give you all sorts of very interesting but likely off-topic concepts. So this is a strategy, an evidence-based strategy for supporting strong classroom management is operationally defining what our expectations are as a community, a learning community, and then defining them very, very discreetly so that it is clear. I know if you are ready because you're at your computer, you're watching and you're listening, and you have all of your materials. And not only are they available, but those materials are prepared and you have a mindset for learning. Similarly, with being responsible and respectful, I, as the instructor, can ascertain the extent to which you, as an individual learner or as a group of learners, are being responsible and respectful because we have come to a general agreement as to what does it look like, sound like to be responsible and respectful. All right. Well, thank you for engaging in that activity with me. So here we are. We're almost a half hour in, and I'm finally getting to the session abstract. Well, the reason it's taken this long is because I wanted to model or demonstrate some of the very practices I'm going to suggest you use and are embedded in the content moving forward in today's PowerPoint. Here's our session abstract. You've already read it before. That's in part why you elected to join this session, and certainly you can read it at your own leisure. But here are our learning objectives. We want to identify environmental conditions that support effective classroom management. We subsequently want to develop class-wide expectations and routines that support the learning of all students. And then we want to apply reinforcement-based approaches that support learning in our own host environments. So here we go with our first activity from the Padlet. In the upper right-hand corner, you will see occasionally this Padlet icon. When you see a slide that has the Padlet icon, that means there is either a resource or an activity that is on Padlet. At this time, then, I would welcome you to go to the Padlet and download the KWL chart because we're going to use it in a brief activity where I would like to, and I'm just going to, again, demonstrate this for you. So I'm going to bump out of PowerPoint and just go to Padlet, but it is right here. And if you're, again, less familiar with Padlet, you find the document, the KWL chart, and these three vertical dots. You click on that, and then one of your options is download. You won't see as many of the options as I have because I have, administrative privileges, or you can just simply click on it. And then you can download it. So what I would like you to do is, and I know in the PowerPoint I said 5 minutes, but I want to get to some more content. So in the interest of time, I'm going to shorten that and say, I'm going to give you 3 minutes. So 3 minutes for you to write down in your KWL chart the first two columns. What do you already know? And what do you want to know? You are not submitting this for attendance verification or anything else. This is the honor system in which I am optimistic that you will honor my request, demonstrating being ready and responsible and respectful by filling out what do you already know and what do you want to know about preventative classroom management strategies. So go ahead. And I said 3 minutes and we're about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes already in. So I'm going to mute myself for a few moments and just check the chat to see if I've missed anything, but we'll be back in a little less than 2.5 minutes. This is your 1 minute warning. I will start up again in 1 minute. I appreciate that all of you have been showing a great deal of respect by engaging in this activity. We have about 7 more seconds before I will continue on. And stop. If you didn't finish it, that's okay. As I noted earlier, I'm not asking you to submit this for verification. If, however, we were a much smaller class, I could perhaps use this KWL chart as a way of formatively assessing at the end of the session today what you knew, what you wanted to learn, and then what you did learn at the conclusion of the session. That's a formative assessment approach, but that's content from actually a session that I gave yesterday. All right, so here we go. Next activity, got 2 activities back to back. With this one, again, you're going to go to the Padlet, and thank you, Caroline, for posting the link to the Padlet for anybody who happened to join us a little bit late. Go to the Padlet, and there is an activity, instructional practices for classroom management, and you will see a series of questions related to effective classroom management strategies, and it uses a 3-point Likert scale. 1, 2, 3, to self-appraise your own practices. I'm going to give you just 2 minutes to do this one, again, in the interest of time, so 2 minutes. And you are not submitting this to anyone. So this is, once again, on the honor system that you're going to show respect by engaging in this activity and not sharing it with anyone else. So please, for the next 2 minutes, take a look at that and self-appraise your own practices. Here's your 1 minute warning, and I will start up again. Thank you all for demonstrating respectfulness by completing this activity in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so we're going to continue. If you haven't already figured it out, I'm a behaviorist, so I count just about everything, including how much time I allocate for our activities. All right. So that's just a self-appraisal that I think could be very beneficial for any of us as we are educating learners in any environment as a way to kind of progress monitor how we're doing across time. So what are some strategies that maybe I'm not using very often, and then make a concerted effort to deploy those strategies in a period of time, and then maybe reevaluate our own practices at the conclusion of that period of time to see, have we moved the needle on evidence-based practices regarding classroom management? The research, what does the research say about evidence-based practices regarding classroom management? Well, the research is very, very clear in that if you do a lot of preventative work, then you stand to have a very well-managed classroom. In fact, the reason for today's session is to really highlight many of those, but not all, preventative approaches. There is a research summary from Randy Simonson and colleagues. It's an old one by comparison to today being 2025, but the research is quite compelling, even though it is that old. What was effective, 17 years ago is equally effective today. So we're going to talk about some of these, of course, not all of them, but some of them. So a lot of effort can be put into classroom management from a preventative perspective. And so that's why we're going to talk largely about those preventative approaches, as well as a few intervening approaches. So one of those strategies from a prevention-based perspective, just think about how are we structuring our classroom, the physical layout of the classroom. So this includes things like classroom arrangement of furniture, scheduling. So what does the schedule look like? Whether it be an elementary setting or a middle high school setting, I would categorize those more as like secondary. The scheduling is going to obviously look different, but we have to be mindful of the schedule, whether we're scheduling for an entire day with the same group of kids as we typically do in an elementary setting, or we're scheduling at the secondary level for a block of time, 39 minutes, 45 minutes, or if you're in a block schedule, maybe 90 minutes, whatever it happens to be. And then as well, just the overall structure of the classroom. When we think about classroom arrangement, you want to be mindful of this as you are setting up your classroom. Here's a perfect opportunity now that we're in the summer, or at least the summer is about to start for everybody. And as we think about moving into next year, here are some questions to ponder as you are designing the arrangement of your classroom. Do you have immediate access to every part of the room? Can you see every setting? Is there a way in which, if applicable, you have schedules that are prominently located so that all can see? Is it possible that students are able to access as appropriate the materials they need within the classroom, and so forth? So think about some of these questions. For example, I've been in some classrooms where there is a space in the classroom where the teacher cannot see the student or students, and so that creates a problem. There is a golden opportunity for a student to engage in contextually inappropriate behavior because the teacher is unable to provide that visual supervision. Or if we think about proximity, the ease with which you as the adult can get to every location where a student might be in the classroom. So contrast two different classrooms in which one classroom has easy access to virtually every spot in the room versus a classroom in which it's almost like there is this obstacle course that individuals have to maneuver in order to get to a certain spot in the classroom. That second classroom is going to create potential problems with regard to classroom management because it's going to take a lot more effort to get to a location if someone needs to provide that proximity control that is so abundantly helpful when trying to manage students' behavior. So just think about some of these questions in your mind as you're arranging your classroom. What we do know that as students' physical space decreases in a classroom, all the bad things happen. And think about your own self. If you have less space, you tend to get a little bit more emotionally charged. Things maybe bother you a little bit more that they otherwise would not. If you had more space, there's more opportunities for things to occur that kind of disrupt you or dysregulate you. So we have to think about how do we arrange our classroom and all of the contents in a classroom such that we can maximize students' physical space. And one of the easiest ways in which we can do that is consider how students are seated, how their desks are arranged. Now, the next couple of slides focus on if you have desks in your classroom. If you are, say, for example, a secondary science classroom where you might have tables or lab stations, that's going to look a lot different, and you may not have the luxury of designing your classroom and its physical space and the furniture within it. But for many situations, not all, but for many situations, you as the instructor have the capacity to design where the desks are located. So here's the more traditional option in which we've got students that are in rows and columns. This is ideal for certain types of learning situations, but not ideal, for example, when we want to engage in a fair amount or a large amount of cooperative learning activities. Because if you want to do cooperative groups and students have to move their desks, that creates problems, especially with the younger ones. It's loud, and invariably somebody's stuff falls out, they got a problem. So you want to think about what is your primary modality of teaching and instructing your students, and then think about, is this the best option? This option also is not quite good for proximity control, which we know is an evidence-based practice. And this type of an arrangement provides the capacity for kind of two kids to talk to each other, and then that ultimately distracts everybody around them. So this may not be the best option. Another option might be the neighborhood option, like this, where you've got pods or neighborhoods of desks that are combined, usually in 4, maybe 6, but that gets a little large if you have more than 4. Great strategy if you're planning on utilizing cooperative groups. It also is very helpful for maintaining proximity control very easily as the adult in the classroom. But the problem here is that if two kids start conversing with each other, now it's going to distract a lot more. And we run into the problems that kids are now physically closer to each other, so there's more opportunities for them to kick each other, touch each other, whether it's intentional or not. So it does create some challenges there. And finally, if you're kind of doing some more traditional lecture style instruction, half of your class is going to have their backs to you. So that may not work very well. So once again, I'm not suggesting that option A or B is the best. I'm just saying that they present different advantages and disadvantages. Similarly, the last option that I wanted to share with you is this option. It's more like the horseshoe-shaped arrangement. This type of an arrangement facilitates better proximity control of students. It, however, is not efficient for cooperative learning activities. And we still run into the problem that that if kids start conversing, they will potentially distract other kids around them, but maybe not as much as if you had the previous option where you had neighborhoods or pods of students. This arrangement also does separate them a little bit, so they're not physically touching or at least near each other to the extent that that could cause some problems, especially in certain environments with maybe perhaps younger age students. So lots of options to think about. Each one has its own advantages and disadvantages. Therefore, when you're designing, even before the kids come into your classroom, think about, how am I arranging my desks or my tables? And how does that arrangement increase or decrease opportunities for contextually inappropriate behavior to occur, as well as does that arrangement align with how I intend on teaching? So that's the arrangement. Second consideration before the kids even come in your classroom is to think about the schedule. Now, Charlie Hughes and colleagues at Penn State a number of years ago really did some innovative work on this notion of, we've got allocated time, that is how much is in the school day allocated for instruction. So you have the kids for 6.5 hours, or if you're a secondary teacher, you only have them for 43 minutes or whatever it happens to be. That's the total amount of time you have them. But allocated time is very different than how much time they're actually engaged. And then even more importantly, how much they're not only engaged, but they're engaged successfully. It's that last concept, that academic learning time, that is critical, because we want to maximize our academic learning time. It is one thing to have kids engaged, but if they're engaged and they're making lots of errors, that is not profitable for our learners. If, however, they are engaged and they are successful, that's the sweet spot that we need to find and maximize. So, how do we ensure that kids are maximally and successfully engaged? Classroom management. But also, we want to make sure that our instruction is engaging, that it's at a level that is beneficial to them. It's not too hard. It's kind of like the Goldilocks framework. We want it to be too hard or too easy. We want it to be right kind of in the middle. Obviously, that is way easier said than done, especially if you are in a classroom that has 25 or 35 or 40 students, or some of our specialist teachers might have 60 or 70 students. How do you find the sweet spot of 60 different kids? That is the challenge. That's the science as well as the art and the craft of teaching. I don't have that answer in today's session. That's another session, but we want to think about how do we maximize that academic learning time? And generally speaking, it's all about engaging kids in instruction that is at their sweet spot. Not too hard, not too easy. So those are, in brief, some preventative approaches to managing a classroom, thinking about how do we arrange the physical space? How do we also then arrange the schedule such that we are also then designing our lessons that maximize academic learning time? I'm going to pause there and just double check, make sure there aren't any comments in the chat. So at this point, if you had a comment and you wanted to put one in, please do so. If you don't have any comments, that's fine. I will move on to the next learning objective. And I'm looking in the chat and I'm not seeing anything. So, all right. Well, Caroline, of course, has been tasked with interrupting me if you think of a comment or a question and you put it in the chat and I miss it. But otherwise, I'm going to move on to our next learning objective, which is developing class-wide expectations and routines that support learning. Okay, if we think about the structure of the classroom, and here by structure here, I'm not talking about the physical structure, I'm talking about more the operation or the things that go on in a classroom that are intangible. And while perhaps maybe an oversimplification, I do tend to think of the intangible structure or organization of a classroom into two buckets. One is rules, and the other bucket is routines. Rules are the statements that provide general guidance as to what students should do, and frankly, what adults should do as well. These are then applied across all settings, and we oftentimes, or ideally, are writing these rules in a manner such that the rules are observable and they can be measured. In other words, we can physically sense them, usually by seeing them, maybe hearing them. But then also, if necessary, we can measure the extent to which a student followed that rule or did not follow that rule. The second bucket that I would describe or categorize as classroom organization is in regards to routines. Now, routines are related to rules, but they're not the same. Routines are a specific set of procedures that students must follow in order to maintain a orderly classroom environment and also subsequently increase our academic learning time. Now, routines oftentimes vary from one setting in a building to another. Routines tell the learners how to do whatever it is they're expected to do. Generally speaking, rules are things that are established across the entire building, with maybe a few exceptions of unique rules that are specific to a particular school environment. But overall, the rules are general across all of the building. Routines, however, are very unique to an individual classroom setting. Some literature from a number of years ago indicated that in a typical elementary classroom, there were upwards of 40 different routines that kids had to learn and manage in order to be efficient and basically engaging appropriately in the lesson. 40 different routines. That's a lot of routines for kids to remember. So what do I mean? Like, what's an illustration of routine? Well, what's the routine for asking the teacher for help? What's the routine for sharpening my pencil if we're still using pencils in some learning environments? What's the routine to request going to the bathroom? What's the routine to line up in an elementary setting? Or what's the routine for leaving the classroom when the bell rings? What's the routine for accessing materials in my backpack if you have cubbies at the back of a classroom? Or what's my routine for accessing something that I forgot in my locker for class? Those are all different routines. And think about your own experiences as a student. For me, it was a number of years ago, but I can still recall that different teachers had different routines for the same activity. Yet, if we don't think about how we explicitly teach those routines, that's where contextually inappropriate behavior can potentially emerge. So let's talk a little bit more deeply about rules and routines. What I'd like you to do is, for 1 minute, just do a brain dump. Brain dumps are simply like free association, if you want to think of this from a psychoanalytic kind of perspective, but we're not in therapy here. What's basically, in 1 minute, I just want you to think about this particular prompt. And you have to think about it. You don't have to write it down. You're not going to share it out. But I want you to think about when you were in a new situation or a context where you didn't know what was expected of you. For example, maybe the last time you were in an unfamiliar city or town, or maybe at a social gathering that you had never been to before. Think about, how did you act? How did you know how to act? What was your experience like? So go ahead for 1 minute and just do a brain dump. Just think about this. How did you know how to act? What was your experience like when you were in that new or novel situation? Another 15 seconds. Great. So thank you. Again, no expectation to put in the chat, but Nadine, thank you for commenting there that you take cues from others around you. And it looks like at least a couple of people said, yeah, they agree. That's generally what we do. We kind of look around at, like, what is everybody else doing? Well, imagine if you happen to select like the absolute worst person to use as a model and mimic them. Or, Shannon saying we ask questions. Yeah. So if you happen to be lucky and you pick the right model to mimic, great. Or if you're unlucky and you pick somebody who also doesn't know what they're doing, you might end up making some mistakes. So the point of all of this is to say, when we're in a new situation, we really don't know what to do. So we have to kind of use social cues to figure out what to do. But we're adults. We've been around for a while. We've figured this out. Think about elementary age kids, or even think about some high school kids who maybe don't know to do that, or they picked the wrong model. All of this is to suggest that what we need to do is be very clear as to what our expectations are. We need to further define what those expectations are into rules, and that's what we did a little bit earlier. And then, as we'll see in a moment, you got to teach them. The way in which we take our expectations and establish rules is by developing something referred to as a behavior matrix. So what is it and how do you build it? So a behavior matrix is just simply taking expectations and then operationally defining them. If you happen to work in a school that is implementing school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports, or PBIS, then this should sound very familiar. If you're scratching your head wondering, I don't think I'm in one of those schools, then this likely is new content for you. A behavior matrix is a process and a protocol that we use by literally developing a table that helps us operationally define what our expectations look like in every single setting. Typically, those expectations are school-wide expectations the whole school adopts. If you are in a PBIS school, then those should be very familiar things like be ready, be respectful, be responsible. If you're not in a PBIS school, these are, broadly speaking, 3 to 5 positively stated expectations that are emblematic of what our school community embraces. So those are the rows of the table, those expectations, and then the columns represent each setting across a school environment. In the intersection of the row and the cell is where we list the behaviors. So here we go. Here is a prototype of a behavior matrix. So we have our expectations in the rows, and then we have our settings in the columns. Notice then the intersection of all of these is where we would list specific behaviors that are demonstrative of expectation 1 in setting A, expectation 2 in setting A, and so forth. If this is starting to sound a little familiar, even from today's session, that's intentional, because you will probably recall we did this at the very beginning of today's session. Here's an illustration of a junior high school's behavior matrix. Their expectations are being responsible, respectful, and kind. And then what do those three expectations look like, sound like? I don't know about smell or taste like, but looks like and sounds like on the bus, hallway, in the cafeteria, in the restroom, classroom, and so forth. So once we establish our expectations and operationally define them in, say, for example, the classroom, then we have to explicitly teach it. We can't just assume that kids will be able to look around for social cues or ask questions in order to exhibit contextually appropriate behavior. Making those assumptions will lead to bad outcomes. Instead, we explicitly teach these expectations, just like we teach academics, we teach them explicitly. And by explicitly here, what I mean is we very systematically teach kids how to engage in those expectations. We teach them in the natural settings. So if we want to teach hallway behavior, we go in the hallway with the classroom, with the class, and we teach them what are our expectations to be respectful, responsible, and kind in the hallway. And if you're wondering, do you really do this with high school kids? Yes, absolutely. We cannot assume that every kid in a high school setting knows how to engage in the transitions of a hallway and stairwells, and that occurs on a regular basis within a secondary setting. We can't, it would be ideal, a utopian world in which we lived if all kids knew how to engage in those behaviors. But none of us lives in that utopian world. Instead, we must teach these, and we would typically teach these very heavily at the beginning of the year. And then as the year progresses, and we notice that maybe students are less behaviorally appropriate in the cafegimatorium, then we can revisit what are appropriate behaviors in the cafegimatorium. We reteach those as the need arises. And those are those booster sessions that I referenced in the last bullet. But also, in addition to teaching kids these expectations, we concurrently want to make sure that we are providing immediate corrective feedback when they make a mistake, and then also reinforce kids when they exhibit the behaviors we want. And you want to do this corrective and reinforcing feedback very heavily as kids are acquiring the skills of demonstrating the expectations. So in that early phase of learning, the acquisition phase of learning, we want to provide a heavy dosage of corrective and reinforcing feedback. Notably, corrective feedback shouldn't be punitive in nature. It should be educative, meaning if I don't exhibit the expectations of walking down the hallway, then you as the instructor tell me, hey, that's not what we're supposed to do. Instead, we should do X, Y, and Z. So you're explicitly telling me what I should do instead. So that is what we ought to do once we've established our expectations and we have developed that behavior matrix. We go about teaching. Now, I'm looking at the clock and I realize we only have 16 minutes left. And so I don't want to waste a whole lot of time showing some videos that you could otherwise look at, but I have hyperlinked just a couple, two very simplistic versions of teaching expectations in an elementary office and library setting, as well as in a hallway. These come from, one comes from Vimeo and one comes from YouTube. Vimeo actually is a great platform for lots of different PBIS rules and expectation videos, and there are a whole bunch from secondary settings as well. But again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over those. So that's how we set up our expectations and the behaviors that are demonstrative of expectations, and then we explicitly teach those expectations. But remember, I said that's one bucket. The other bucket is the routines. And here is just a very, very short list of routines that are commonplace in elementary and or secondary settings. And there are certainly many, many more. So when we think about routines, a framework that I think is incredibly beneficial in organizing how not only we structure routines, but also then teach routines. And that is CHAMP. CHAMP is an acronym that stands for Conversation, Help, Activity, Movement, and Participation. And once again, because there is a Padlet icon in the upper right corner on the Padlet, I'm just going to bump out again real quick and go to the Padlet. On the Padlet, you should see the CHAMP routine, classroom routine worksheet, so you can download that. And I'm going to do that just real quick. just to show you briefly what it is. In a CHAMPS classroom routine worksheet, again, this is something you as the instructor think about and develop before your kids come into the classroom. Perhaps maybe in secondary settings, you could do this with your students so that they have ownership and voice. I wouldn't recommend including your elementary, particularly your primary grade students in this, because you'll come up with all sorts of weird suggestions as to how to navigate typical routines. But you write down the routine up here, and then you basically reflect upon and respond to questions around what type of conversation is permissible. Who is allowed to speak? In what manner? For what reason? Then you think about, how do kids get questions answered, or how do they get attention from you during that routine? What do they do if they have to wait for your help during that routine? What is expected of them during that routine? So what is the end product, but also perhaps maybe what are the sequences of events that they have to complete in order to successfully engage in the totality of the activity? For example, if they need to go get something out of their locker and you're in a secondary setting, what are the sequences of events that they have to engage in appropriately in order to complete that activity? Do they have to raise their hand? Do they have to get a hall pass? Do they have to have their agenda and you sign it? And so what's the hall pass situation look like? How do they navigate that? Then what's the expectation that how many minutes do they have before they are expected to be back in the classroom? So that would be the sequence of events that you would consider around what eventually leads to the end product of that activity. That also then, of course, leads into what considerations regarding student and adult movement is required of that activity. And then, how do students demonstrate that they are participating fully and responsively in that particular activity? And what behaviors maybe are demonstrative of students not appropriately participating in that activity? The first page is the prompting questions that gets you thinking about how do you go about setting up routines. The second page of this is just an illustration of what a routine for a pair share activity would look like. So somebody has taken the liberty of jotting down their reflections on how they would set up the routine that is going to be deployed in a classroom setting around a pair sharing activity. So that is in the Padlet, and I encourage you to consider that as a resource as you think about what routines are salient in your setting and which ones then you want to make sure, oops, sorry, going in the wrong direction. Then explicitly teaching that routine. So once you've filled out the champ sheet around a particular routine, then it's incumbent upon you as the instructor to spend time explicitly teaching that routine, just like we're teaching the rules from previously. So we want to teach the routines exactly the same way as we have taught those same rules, in which we actively engage our learners in the natural setting. We teach it just like academics. We teach it very heavily at the beginning of the year. We use corrective and reinforcing feedback during the acquisition phase of learning. And then as kids start making mistakes around some of those routines throughout the year, we reteach, just like we would reteach a mathematics concept or a mathematics skill that maybe we thought our class knew, and they demonstrated mastery of that skill last week, but now all of a sudden everybody has seemingly forgot how to do it. What do? We reteach it. If we use that same approach to teaching math skills, why don't we use the same approach to teaching social skills or behavioral skills as well? In my view, we should use the exact same approach to teaching contextually appropriate behavior as we use for teaching math skills. So that concludes our second of three sections. I want to pause and just give an opportunity for anybody who maybe has some questions. Thank you, Caroline, for monitoring the chat. Yes, the slide deck has those links to those videos. I just checked the videos earlier today, so I know they work. I just didn't have enough time to actually show those videos. I had them queued up and ready, but okay. All right. So we're moving on in our last 10 minutes, the third area of our session today, and that is, how do we use reinforcement-based approaches that promote pro-social behaviors supportive of learning? So the first two sections were all about what do you do in preparation for, or what are the preventative strategies we can deploy before our kids even come into the classroom? And then as soon as they are in the classroom, we teach rules and expectations and routines. So those are more preventative in nature. This last area of our session today is all about what are the intervening strategies we can use once the kids are before us. They're in our classroom. How do we support them in that regard? Can't stress enough the power of reinforcement. Any behavior that is immediately, or if you're a little bit older, like secondary ages, it's appropriate to have somewhat delayed reinforcement, but particularly for our youngest learners, the immediacy of that reinforcement is so critical. If you even wait a couple of seconds to reinforce a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old kid, they won't know what they're getting reinforced for. So we want to have that immediacy of reinforcement is so incredibly powerful. You also want to make sure that you're aware of a very heavy ratio of reinforcement to corrective feedback. I know this is what we all aspire. We want to provide positive reinforcement at a heavier dosage than corrective feedback. We all want to do that, but it's hard in the moment. As a parent, as I've noted to you earlier, I never had a class of 25 students. I taught in higher ed, a little bit different context. However, in that context, or even as a parent with our own kids, we made sure that we were providing a heavier dosage of reinforcement to corrective feedback. And we want to do that. And in particular, for students with disabilities, that ratio likely needs to be even higher. By some estimates, 15 reinforcers for every 1 corrective feedback. That's a lot. And we also want to be using behavior-specific praise. So what the heck is behavior-specific praise? Behavior-specific praise is a verbal statement, not a gesture or a look. It is a verbal statement that is delivered immediately after the desired behavior has been exhibited. Of course, a short delay is acceptable for developmentally appropriate older age students. And importantly, the behavior-specific praise that we deliver specifically states the desired behavior that was demonstrated. If you are using a token economy system, which is commonplace in PBIS systems, then you want to use behavior-specific praise with your tokens as well. If you are not working in an environment in which a token economy system is present, then no worries, you can still use behavior-specific praise. Importantly, those are the 3 defining features of behavior-specific praise. It's got to be verbal. It has to be delivered relatively immediately after the desired behavior is exhibited, and the verbalization has to state exactly what the behavior was that resulted in that reinforcement. 3 key features. Hope you got those, because right now I'm going to ask you, well, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to see if some of my situations are representative of verbal behavior-specific praise. So what we know, just briefly, because, I always go back to the science, why is behavior-specific praise relevant? Well, this is just a short list of research that says, yeah, it works really well. So you don't need just one research article to suggest this is an effective practice. We got a whole host of them. So what's the rationale? Well, the bottom line is that the research clearly demonstrates it is an effective practice. So here we go. In the chat, you're going to type either an E or an N upon me reading a scenario. So you got to wait until I finish reading the scenario. Then you're going to type in the chat either an E, because that's an example of behavior-specific praise, or N, because that's not an example of behavior-specific praise. So you're going to write either E or N. First scenario, student enters the class during educator-directed instruction. The student quietly walks to his seat. The instructor walks over to the student and whispers, "Thank you for coming in the room quietly." Is this an example, E, or a non-example? Go ahead. Got lots of E's. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Yes. Perfect. Okay. Excellent. Now let's look at another scenario. A student enters the class. This is going to look similar until the very end. A different student enters the class during educator-directed instruction. The student quietly walks to the seat. The educator gives the student a thumbs up to recognize the quiet entry. Is this an example or a non-example? E or N? Go ahead. E or N? Yes. I see lots of N's. That's fantastic. It is a non-example. Why? Because it wasn't a verbal statement and it didn't specifically identify what the behavior was that resulted in the reinforcement. Okay, let's just do one more. During teacher-directed instruction, one student is poking and attempting to talk with another student who responds by showing the class the quiet symbol, like hands up or fist or whatever it happens to be. The educator immediately looks at the second student, gives a thumbs up sign and mouths, meaning they move their lips without sound. Thank you for paying attention. Is this an example or non-example? Go ahead in the chat. All right. We got some N's, we got some E's, so we're a little bit less clear on this one. If there is a correct answer, I would go in the direction of, it's an example because they were providing a verbalization, although it was moving the mouths, although I guess I could see where, this is a tough one. I could go either way on this one. Maybe I need to refine this particular one. If you put a non-example, it was likely because they didn't verbalize it. If you put an example, it was an example because they mouthed it, and so you could read the lips. I could give you credit for that one. I need to get a better example. My apologies. All right. So in our remaining 6 minutes, which I know, or excuse me, 4 minutes, which I know is woefully inadequate, I do want to just simply draw your attention to the final thing that I've run out of time to go through, and that is developing group contingencies. So what is, in brief, a group contingency? I'm just going to briefly share with you what it is, and then point you in the direction of a resource that walks you through the steps of how to create a group contingency. There are 3 broad types of group contingencies. Basically, a group contingency is one behavior plan for all kids. Kind of makes it much more efficient to have one behavior plan. So one type of group contingency is referred to as an independent group-oriented group contingency, where the standard is the same for all kids. They have all the same level of expectation, but each kid is individually responsible for their own behavior, and subsequently, their own behavior dictates whether they get the reinforcer or they don't get the reinforcer. The illustration would be a teacher offers extra recess or additional social time to any student who turns in a completed homework assignment. If you turn in your homework assignment, you get extra social time. If you don't turn it in, you don't get that extra social time. So that's an independent contingency. Some advantages and disadvantages are listed right there. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the second type of group contingency, referred to as an interdependent contingency. Here, the standard is the same for everybody, but collectively, we are all in this together. We either all get it because of all of our behavior, or none of us get it because people in our group didn't meet that expectation. So an illustration would be a teacher gives extra recess or social time to everyone in the class if everyone in the class turns in their homework assignment completed. We're all in this together. Same standard for everybody. We either all get the reinforcer or we don't, and whether we get it or not is dependent on all of us. You can imagine a disadvantage here is if you have kids who sabotage it or maybe are viewed as scapegoats when the group doesn't get the reinforcer. That is a distinct disadvantage of this type of group contingency. Therefore, we have the third type, which is a dependent type. In this one, the same standard is applied to everybody, but only a subset of people in that group are responsible for whether the group gets the reinforcer or not. And in most dependent group-oriented group contingencies, the subset of students or the individual student who is responsible for whether the whole group gets it or not should not be known to the kids. Otherwise, you can imagine everybody would scapegoat that one kid or that small group of kids who kind of ruined it for the group. So the illustration here is everyone gets extra social time if 2 randomly selected students in the class turn in their completed homework assignments. Again, some advantages and disadvantages, but importantly, we want to make sure that you don't publicly announce who the kids are, the subset of kids are that dictate whether the whole group gets the reinforcer or not. So these group contingencies have advantages and disadvantages, but all of them are highly efficacious for reducing disruptive behavior and increasing or concurrently increasing contextually appropriate behavior. Of course, we know that teachers prefer the independent and dependent type. Students tend to prefer the independent type. They prefer to be on their own and just the masters of their own destiny. But there are multiple reasons as to why that might be the case. So, in conclusion, because I ran out of time, I prepared way too much, I do want to draw your attention to, in the Padlet, there is a step-by-step practice guide on how to develop a group contingency. And I would welcome anyone to use that. It is hopefully task analyzed enough that you can do it on your own. So I have subsequently run out of time. I am terribly sorry, but that is all, folks. I appreciate your attention. I will stick around for a couple of minutes if you have questions.